Painless Operations with Bob Walker.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company empowering .NET teams everywhere. And we want them to be able to deliver world-class results. And we use the ClearMeasure way for effective software teams methodology to do that. My architect forums are going strong and signups for the next session are up. So if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with some peer architect leaders, then just sign up at the link in the show notes. And for those of you who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. And a quick note, ClearMeasure is hiring software architects of all levels. And so if you're interested, just go to clearmeasure.com and go to the careers page, and we'd love to talk to you. For my guest today on the show, I have Bob Walker. Bob started off as a .NET developer back in the early days of .NET 1.1 with the goal of converting ASP pages to ASP.NET web applications. And during that time, his career progressed from .NET developer to lead developer to architect to where he is today. As a technical director at Octopus Deploy, he helps solve complex customer problems. And as a team, they at Octopus help answer both technical and non-technical questions. Bob has been a fan of making it easier to deploy software since the early 2010s. When working for a company, the only time to deploy to production was 2 a.m. on Saturday. I think everybody's been there. But that's led him down the path of CI/CD and DevOps and test-driven development and automating all the things. And he was exposed to Redgate tooling as well and Octopus Deploy while working at Farm Credit Services of America. And he's been a fan ever since. And in his current role, Bob gets to work with a variety of technologies every day. Well, Bob, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm good.
Great.
Yeah, it's a great day. I appreciate you taking some time and coming on the show. There's so much I want to ask you about, and you spoke about some of this at the recent Kansas City Developers Conference, and you do other types of speaking. But before we kind of get into that, for the people who maybe haven't heard you speak or are getting to know you for the first time, would you mind sharing what are some high points in your career that kind of landed you into doing the type of work that you're doing today?
Yeah, no. So I'd say one of the biggest high points of my career was being one of the champions of automating database deployments, because that to me is such a interesting problem to solve. And being able to do that, then seeing that spread across all these other teams, that was a huge high point for me. It was like I was really happy with something like that. In terms of like development, one of the big things that I'm always really proud of is a company that I worked for a little while ago. And we were working on this application that originally was written in Oracle packages. And we converted everything over to .NET service. And we're able to improve the speed from 500 milliseconds per request down to 50 milliseconds per request. And we actually broke all the graphs because everyone is so expected everything to take so much longer. So those are some of the big things. But doing that, I really adopted test-driven development, solid programming principles, everything along those lines was my first big exposure to doing something like that. So yeah, those are kind of my two big high points in my life. And that kind of having to go through that and deploy that software was not fun. And having to deal with the database wasn't fun. And so I've just been a big fan of automation ever since.
Nice. I want to ask you about deployment topics, but you mentioned test-driven development, and I've encountered so many people who, when they finally tried it, they got hooked for life.
Mhm.
But I don't hear people who really tried it and said, "Oh yeah, I tried it and decided that it's not worthwhile." So I'm curious, what was it about it that um, made you think, "Yeah, this is a good way to do software"?
It was more about the way that I had to architect my software to make it testable.
Hmm.
Because so much of it was about, okay, I'll just throw this code together and everything should work. So I'm writing these big old methods in my classes and not, I'm not really thinking how I need to structure this code in order to make it testable. But then thinking about test-driven development and taking that big step back and go, oh, well, I didn't make this testable at all. And I've made this so complex that no one can understand it.
Hmm.
Well, I'm making, and then I had to make my test so complex, and that just takes forever to write. So I was like, all right. So it kind of just is it's almost like a snowball effect almost when you start going down that path. And then you go, oh, this is a much better way. I don't have to get up in the middle of the night because I got paged because something stopped working because I missed some sort of bug.
Hmm.
Once you have that big, robust test suite out there, I think one application I worked on had something like 10,000 unit tests and it can run in 5 minutes. And I would
Hmm.
know, hey, this application is going to work when I push it out to production. So that's kind
Yeah,
of, I think that to me is like the big selling points from that.
yeah, nice. So you've done a lot of speaking on the topic of DevOps in general,
Mhm.
but most recently at the Kansas City Developers Conference on the operations side, with deploying to production isn't the end; it's kind of the beginning because now people can actually use the software. And you talked about painless operations, that general theme. Are there just some rules of thumb that people really need to get right in order to make running their software system more painless?
That's a good question. A couple of rules of thumb is make sure you have the appropriate monitoring in place to find any sort of issues and find little problems before they become catastrophic problems. I can think of a handful of times when, with the appropriate monitoring, we were able to detect small performance problems that slowly started ticking up and something that
Hmm.
jumped from 50 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds. The average person's probably not going to notice that. But we noticed that, like, that's not a good thing. And we're able
Hmm.
to issue a fix right away. So having the monitoring in place and the alerting in place to find those types of issues is really important. And then the other big thing is really kind of investing in your platform and investing in the how you want your deployments to work, how you want your infrastructure to be built out. Don't just let willy-nilly anything go, is really invest and make sure it's a really rock solid platform and you know it's going to work each time. Specifically, I'm thinking about your CI/CD platform.
Hmm. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
One of the sticky things, not only in deploying, but also operating, tends not to be the web application or a backend service or online web services, but databases.
Mm,
It doesn't seem like the major vendors out there, like, SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, are just solving that problem flat out. It seems like every development team is having to go through the process of figuring out how to do it. Is that problem solved and people just don't know what the solution is, or what's the status of that?
I think the problem is solved and most people just don't realize there's a better way. You just get trapped into, I can open up SQL Management Studio and I can make the change in the UI and then happy days. I can just keep on doing that each time. Or you get trapped into the, oh, I can just run this tool that will generate my this comparison script and everything will work out fine. I do think it is solved. There's two general schools of thought. There's the state-based management where you have a desired state that you want to get to, and you let the tool figure out how to get to that desired state.
Hmm.
And then you have the migration approach where you write those migration scripts, or you can have a tool write those migration scripts for you, and you store that in source control. The big thing is you store your database schema in source control, or your change scripts in source control, and then that's what gets pushed up along with it. And so there's a number of tools out there. There's the liquid bases, there's the flyaways of the world that really help solve all these problems for you. I'm just surprised when I encounter people who are just like, yeah, the database bits, that's the DBA's problem to solve. We'll just kind of do our own thing. Or all I do is I'm sure you've encountered this as well, where they email the DBAs, hey, can you run this script for me? And the script is attached or something ridiculous like that. And like, that's just absolutely insane to me.
Yeah. Well, until we know that there's a better way, we
Yeah.
just do what a horror story. I'll tell you a horror story that I'm sure everybody has. And it was 18 years ago. I still remember it. Ended up being an all-nighter. We crafted a bunch of scripts, and they'd been in multiple test environments. Everything was great. And it was that situation where there was somebody else that had credentials to the database. It was not automated 18 years ago in that situation. And they ran it, and the application came up just fine, and everything was all good. And we're like, okay, we're almost, we're done. Okay, yeah, let's go home. It's 11 p.m. on a Friday night. All right, and then he said, "Huh, that's weird," and that's what else. The hard drive space just started whittling away, going down, 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 and the temp database was just growing and growing and growing and growing. And it literally grew to take up every bit of free space until the operating system became unstable and the server just went away.
Wow. Was it a whole bunch of CTEs? What was eating up that temp DB?
Well, it turned out that in some of the test profiling and whatnot, SQL performance tuning wizard had suggested that we reorder a clustered index on a table. Well, guess what? That table in production was orders of magnitude larger than any of the test environments. And that was no good.
And that raises an interesting point, is how do you get production like data down into your development and your testing environment so you don't encounter that issue when you go to production for the very first time? But then that raises the whole, how do you scrub the database? And that's, again, why you need automation for something like that to happen. Because like in today's age, not having a production like database to test against just seems baffling to me, because how else are you going to know your application's performance? Finding all those issues on something like that. So again, that goes back to adopting the tooling and adopting the appropriate scripts to handle a lot of that stuff.
So in your mind, what is the essential tooling? If you were just to go, hey, these are the basics. I mean, do not live without this set.
That's a good question. Are you talking just in the database side, or are you talking like the entire CI/CD pipeline?
Yeah, your CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. Git, obviously, going to be the very first thing. Application, everything should be stored in source control. Distributed source control, I'm a big fan of, so that's why I naturally go to Git at the very beginning. Having some sort of build server that monitors your Git repo. I personally am starting to like GitHub Actions more and more, but I know they're fans of Azure. There's Azure DevOps, their build pipelines. They can make those really robust. I've used those and had a lot of success with them in the past. Same thing with TeamCity or Jenkins. Obviously, for the tool to handle your deployments, you need to have a separate tool that's focused on deployments. Obviously, it's going to be Octopus Deploy. There's no big surprise there.
I'm not sure there's a good alternative.
Not
that I'm aware of.
Not specifically for a lot of the different deployment problems that we have to solve, especially if you're dealing things like where I need to deploy to all of my retail locations or all of my bank locations or something along those lines. Or just you want to have that consistency across all your deployments.
Well, the simple applications, any kind of PowerShell script will do. So you can use any. I mean, you can piggyback off of any build server if it's just simple.
Yeah.
So to be fair, I guess on that.
And it's kind of. I mean, I think I've heard. I can't remember who told me this, but someone said that the most popular deployment to Azure still is right-click deploy. I'm like, well, in terms of number of deployments, I could see that, but I would be very curious to know about the complexity of the application that's going out there with right-click and deploy.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't help that all of the samples seem to be a web application, a web service, and they ignore the database. So in effect, it's just file copies.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, totally. And then getting back to your last question, for database tooling, I've becoming a bigger and bigger fan of the Flyway. I previously was using the Redgate's DLM lifecycle stuff. That worked pretty well, but that was more state-based. I was as you evolve with your database deployments, you're going to migrate away from state-based, because that's typically where everyone wants to start, because they're like, I don't want to have to handwrite anything. And then like, I need to be able to handwrite something. And so then they kind of migrate closer to the flyaway tooling. An alternative is obviously things like DBUp is another one that's out there. But yeah, anything that can manage your database deployments. But I think when you combine all of those tools together, you get a really powerful CI/CD pipeline that's going to handle almost anything you can throw at it.
Okay.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
Back to operating the systems in production and making that painless. What are the critical ingredients there? You mentioned monitoring, but are there certain patterns or how? Because someone might say, "Oh yeah, our IT department has uptime monitoring, and they just ask us for the URL that we want monitored." For significant software systems, what do people need to do to adequately monitor those types of sophisticated software?
Yeah, it's more than just the monitoring. It's also the alerting, but also being able to recover from any sort of issues.
Okay.
One of the things that I really happy about I'm going to use Octopus Cloud as an example is it's more than just I'm going to put an Octopus Deploy instance and have it run. It's something that's going to monitor this service, and it's going to guarantee you're going to have a certain amount of uptime. And if it detects any sort of problem, there's a recovery process that's put into place. There's this automation that's added in there that's going to find that problem, and then it's going to attempt to restore it. And if it can't restore it, then like, okay, now we need to alert people to come in and start solving this particular problem. But so that's part of it. But then there's also the ongoing maintenance that you need to make sure. So having the appropriate things for your file backups and being able to restore those file backups if you need to have something like that, or if you have a obviously with the database, making sure you have the appropriate database maintenance with that, so you can keep your database performance as well. So it's all part of really that kind of that platform you put in together. So it's the monitoring, it's the ability to recover, it's the backups, it's the restoring, it's everything that needs to go in there to make sure that your application is running. And you are only bothered when an important problem happens. So you automate away as much as you can on something like that.
Now you're with you being one of the deepest experts on Octopus Deploy on the planet, and the run books that's there. I want to ask you about where some products start and where others end. So, Azure has a monitoring solution. There's third-party monitoring solutions. Octopus has Runbook, which fits into. So, what's a good combination, and which feature set overlap, and how do they fit together?
Yeah, for monitoring and alerting, it's more like this: something is happening, or I'm more of observability. I want to make sure that everything's working appropriately, and I want to find those edge cases when something's not working appropriately. And then where runbooks would come in, say with Octopus Deploy, is actioning that appropriately. It's being able to call something or having something run on a schedule to respond to some sort of event or respond to some sort of manual intervention. I need to reboot this service. I need to make sure I take a backup of this particular application, or I need to have limited access to be able to do this one little thing on my system. Having some sort of tool in place that enables that, like I said, with those runbooks on something like that. With runbooks, I always look at them as, I said that earlier, is limited production access. Being able to perform some sort of action. If you think about, I want to be able to spin up and down Azure infrastructure, run an ARM template, run Terraform, whatever the case may be. Well, what's going to manage those credentials for you? Who has the permission to do that? Do you give people their own logins to Azure? With something like runbooks, you can abstract a lot of that away. And so you can enable that self-service so people can spin up and down that infrastructure where appropriate.
So let's say someone's using Azure Monitor and they can go into the Azure portal or an ARM template and say, okay, when there's an exception, I want an alert. How does Octopus know that happened so that maybe some script that's underneath a runbook can execute?
Yeah, on something like that, you would need to have that alerting system invoke our CLI to call out to the runbook and say, okay, when this event happens, I need you to do X. So then you can say, okay, I need you to call this runbook using the CLI, or you can use our API, whichever you prefer. If you enjoy writing PowerShell scripts, it's definitely for you.
Yeah.
And then call that out, and then it was going to perform that action. And you can also have your monitoring tool alert you, but you can also have Octopus Deploy alert you, say with Teams or an email or Slack or whatever notification system you prefer to go with. So, hey, I detected this problem. I've called this runbook. The runbook goes, yep, I've now recovered it. I've now recovered this for you, enabled this to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice. Before we run out of time, I want to talk about something that when I talk to developers, some don't really know what it means, or they define it totally differently. And that is the term multi-tenancy and the various ways that it's used. And how does someone know if they have a software system that employs that concept, even if they haven't used the term before? And what are some of the best ways to think about it and practices that are useful if you have a software system that benefits from multi-tenancy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've spent an abnormal amount of time first defining what is a tenant. And so I've come up with two ways to define if you have a tenant. It's I have a customer or I have a physical location. And I need to have some sort of way to isolate them or segregate them to prevent one customer from being able to see another customer's data, or one user being able to see another user's data. That's a bit much if you go down to the user level, but it's like I have a customer. Let's say we sell soft drink software. We have Coca-Cola, Dr. Pepper, and PepsiCo. I can guarantee that all three of them do not want their data to be intermingled with one another. So then you come down to, okay, how can we segregate this data? How can we have different versions of this application for something like that? Now, in terms of the different approaches, that there's really four different approaches that you can take, but it's really going to be, do I provide a SaaS software and I have to figure out how to isolate the data in my data center, or am I going to be deploying the software to my customers and they're going to self-host it in their data center and I have to manage something like that?
Okay, so those are two. You mentioned four. Are the other three just so seldom used that it's not worth mentioning, or can we mention the other two that you're
the other two
of?
are kind of like it's kind of a intermix between the two.
Okay.
So I'm a self-hosted, so I have a SaaS software, and then I have isolated databases per customer as opposed to one big shared database. And then the fourth one is kind of instead of an isolated database, it's more like I have an isolated schema per customer within the same database. I've worked on all four of those, and I can say the isolated schema is probably the worst idea of them all. It is so complex to manage, and you end up with all these dynamic queries in your code base that you're just like, oh my gosh, how do I handle all this? It's just wild when you have to manage that. So,
gotcha. Yeah, I'm thinking of one of the early invisible multi-tenant applications was Salesforce.com, and you kind of could tell because based on who the customer was, you would have a slightly different URL because they would have, some number of production systems, and that production system could hold some number of customers on it.
Yep. Yeah. And that's a case of I'm willing to bet a instance per customer. And we can even also see something similar with Service One and their developer instances that they give you. I don't know if you've ever experimented with the Service One at all. Not Service One.
ServiceNow?
It's ServiceNow. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Service One is a home insurance that I use. Sorry.
Okay.
I just paid the bill.
Hey.
That's what's in my forefront. But yeah, ServiceNow, like every every developer can have their own developer instance.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't use it, they just take it away. And Salesforce, I imagine, is very similar, where if you stop using it, they're just going to shut down that instance.
Yeah.
So they've isolated it down. So every customer, they get their own almost version of the application and probably own version of the database as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And a customer that we had did currency exchanges for banks all over the world. And it was very important in all these different countries that it actually be a totally separate, software system and separate data centers. So even though it was the same version of the software and the database schema and everything, it just had many production environments.
Yep. And so, that's generally the best way to avoid a number of common problems you'll see with multi-tenancy applications. If you opt for I want to have a shared application and a shared database where all the data of all the customers' data is intermingled with one another, you run into issues such as crosstalk, where one customer somehow can see another customer's data, or one customer's data gets written into another customer's data, and you just get this whole mess that you have to deal with. And so, that isolating things down like that, it makes a whole lot of sense. And we do the same thing with Octopus Cloud. There's one, everyone goes to their own unique URL, but behind the covers or under the covers, it's a unique instance. It's a unique database, that your own file storage you get. So I imagine a lot of these custom companies have kind of figured that out as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like there's so many flavors, but logically, if you have a different application instance and logically you have a different database physically, cloud isn't totally physically, but runtime wise, you can have so many of those databases on the same database cluster, and you can have so many of those applications sharing a group of servers or cloud services. So you can kind of multiplex some of those. Even logically, you've completely put boundaries between the customers, right?
Yeah, and this is one of the advantages of a tool like a platform such as Kubernetes, where every customer can get their own namespace, but you're sharing the Kubernetes cluster. I think each, one of our clusters, I think maybe has 5 nodes on it total, but it could be hosting hundreds upon hundreds of different instances. So you kind of get that benefit of economics of scale on something like that. But again, everyone's isolated down, and they get, from all intents and purposes, they have almost their own little cloud inside of a Kubernetes cluster or something like that.
Yeah.
A little sandbox, I guess.
It just occurred to me, I want to see if I'm thinking of it the right way, that if you have multiple customers who are using a piece of software that you are running, not multiple users, but multiple customers, each group of which don't care about the others, totally multiple customers, you're going to have to manage that complexity somewhere. And then it's just a decision. Am I going to manage it in the C# and the queries that developers write? Or am I going to manage it in how I configure runtime environments?
You're 100% right. And it's funny, I just wrote up and finished up an article that's going to be popping up on our blog pretty soon about that very same topic. The question is, where do you want to manage that complexity? Do you want to manage it in your application source code, or do you want to manage it in how you deploy? And I'll be honest, if you asked me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have said, oh, totally within the application source code. But it would just be almost impossible to manage this on the infrastructure side. But now, with all the tools that are available to us, with the different platforms, the Azures of the world, the Kubernetes of the world, the automation that you get from deployment tools, it just doesn't make sense anymore. It's like, no, I'm going to remove all that complexity and all that extra work I have to go in and write all these extra where clauses, and make sure I have everything appropriately tested to make sure that these users can't see each other's data. I'd much rather do that in my infrastructure, and just say, you know what, you're going to get your own you're going to get your own instance, and you're just not going to be able to talk to anybody else. You go over there into your room and you deal with it, that type of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And then if you have a help desk, well, now there's one application, maybe the only application that actually needs any kind of feature set that has visibility to the breadth of the customer base, or the fact that there are many customers, right?
Yeah, it's you manage that in a separate area instead of trying to manage that all within your application, which is what you'd end up having to do if you put all that code in there. So you can almost have a separate tool, and that can have its own release cadence as well, of how fast you want to add new features and new functionality and improve that. Oh, we need to add this new monitoring, or I need to add this new way to spin up a new instance. You're not tied to your application's release cadence at that point. You're tied to your own internal release cadence for that tooling.
Yeah. And I wonder if sometimes the feature development tail wags the architecture dog by thinking, oh, the help desk, well, now every time we add a new customer, this query needs to change because this query is going to be this massive union across, how many different databases. And then someone else says, no, that's the wrong pattern. Instead of going top down, one to many, let's just go many to one and just have all of the individual ones event up some data so that it's there.
Yeah, and that's really where, when you think about it, where things such as Snowflake come into play with those massive data warehouses, or your event, or you're having some sort of message bus to manage a lot of that data, and then you can query that however you want, as long as you have that raw event information coming through appropriately. Oh yeah, 100%. Yes, and again, but you're also, I think that the other thing is you're making it much easier to run the applications themselves, even though you have a lot of copies of them.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, they're not going to be randomly consuming a massive amount of resources at any given point in time. Yeah. Whereas if you have everybody using the same application, I had this happen on an application I was responsible for. One of our bigger customers, they came in and we had the ability to generate reports, and they said, I want 3 years worth of data. And basically everyone else and within the application couldn't use it at all for the 30 minutes while it was generating that report. Because it was consuming all of the resources. And so you get the noisy neighbor impact as well. So now if someone is a noisy neighbor, okay, well, that's on them, and that's that one customer, but it's not impacting anybody else. So it makes it much easier to manage that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially with the sophistication of the cloud generation of infrastructure, the infrastructure is pretty good at putting the applications in a box and say, nope, this is how much slice of the CPUs you get. This is how much memory you get. And they do a pretty good job of constraining them so that the neighbor can be noisy, but everybody else can't hear.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's, I guess, kind of bring it back to the, running applications from an operations point of view, having a smooth thing is you can, by isolating those customers away, you make that so much easier. That's one of the things I really enjoy about using a cloud platform such as Azure is being able to put everyone into their own sandbox like that. Right,
for sure. Well, we could talk for a long time about this. But this is some really good stuff. I know there's so many developers and development teams out there that are just trying to keep their head above water and figure out how to get their applications working and in production, and they don't know what they don't know. But it's great to have you share what the big things that they need to think about, because it's not a million things that they need to do. It's just a handful of really important ones that they need to account for.
Yeah. And any step you take, any improvement you take, it's better. Just improve a little bit each day. It's kind of like learning an instrument. Practice 5 minutes a day, and you'll be surprised how far you'll go in 6 months. You're like, oh my gosh, look what I can do today.
How true. Yeah. Same thing with working out and weight training. You don't have to have a hard workout. Just do one.
Yeah, exactly.
And then have a routine. Awesome. Well, hey, Bob, thanks so much for coming on the Azure DevOps podcast and sharing with us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.